For example, in the book, I talk about a guy who took a depression inventory who definitely identified with perfectly hidden depression, and he'd gone to a psychiatrist to see what was wrong because he thought something was wrong. Well, he scored very well on the depression inventory. He didn't look depressed at all. So I'm not sure what the psychiatrist said to him, but he sent him away. Well, 3 weeks later, he tried to kill himself, and the psychiatrist came to the hospital and said, "Well, I just saw you 3 weeks ago. What you didn't tell me what was going on." And the man looked at him and said, "You didn't ask me the right questions. The question you asked me was..."
Hi, guys. Welcome to the show where we learn from the people who have followed their passion to achieve great success and have impacted many lives. If you're new here, then please do consider subscribing to this channel. This episode is being recorded in association with Let's Localize, an organization with a mission to foster micro contributions from community and businesses to help schools with their need of time, skills, and funding. I'm your host, Ajay Mathur, and my guest today is an author, a speaker, and a psychologist. She has been practicing clinical psychology for nearly 27 years. She has written for various publications, including Huffington Post, Psychology Today, The Mighty, Psych Journal, the Goddam Institute, Psychology, Stigma Fighter, The Godman Project, and many more. Not only that, she has also authored a best-selling book called The Perfectly Hidden Depression, which we will be talking a lot about today. Her podcast called Self Work has been downloaded nearly 1 million times. So please welcome the woman who believes that although depression can be heavily masked by perfectionism, its damage can still be devastating. Therefore, she is on a mission to raise awareness about the perfectly hidden depression, Dr. Margaret Robinson Rutherford. Welcome, Dr. Margaret.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. And I'm going to brag a little bit. Self-Work has now been downloaded 1.6 million times.
Ooh.
So.
Okay, so I have some outdated information. It's 1.6 million. Pretty
No,
cool,
I
huh?
love doing it. Podcasting has really captured my heart. So, but thank you. Perfectly Hidden Depression is something I'm passionate about talking about. So I can't wait to talk to your listeners about it. And there may be some, certainly many of them that may identify with it for sure.
Yeah, definitely. We'll be talking to you about that. But before we go into that, I wanted to ask you, I have read that you had some strange kind of professions before you became a clinical psychologist. I wanted to
Well,
know what was your inspiration and what you were doing before, although it was a long time ago.
well,
How did you
not
come?
that long.
Was it
I'm
that?
not that old. I think I can remember.
Okay.
I thought I was going to be an opera singer, and studied music in school. And then I turned out to be a jazz singer and a jingle singer in Dallas, Texas. Jingles are advertisements, TV and radio ads. And so I spent a lot of my time in front of a microphone singing, and actually loved it, but for a while, I grew tired of not knowing how much money you were going to make and all that kind of thing. So I decided, and I actually also had volunteered at the battered women's shelter in Dallas and loved that. So I switched gears a lot and got a degree in what's called music therapy. And then I did my final internship at a psychiatric residential program, and I loved it. And I thought, no, 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 this is what I want to do. And I had been in therapy a lot myself by that time because I needed it. And so I took another year of classes in psychology, and lo and behold, the program took me in. I think I was a bit of a curiosity. This hotel singer that wanted to be a psychologist, and it took me about 8 years to turn that around, between the year that I took studying, and then it took me 5 or 6 years to get a PhD. So anyway, yeah, and here I am.
So you did your PhD and then you kind of discovered another PhD. Let's talk about the another one.
Yeah. Oh, that other one.
People,
Sure.
The
In fact,
perfectly
that's a bit
hidden
of
depression.
ironic, isn't it? It's a bit ironic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I began blogging in 2012 after my son left for college, and I just had never considered myself a writer either, but I was really supported in doing so and had some time on my hands. And back in April, I guess, of 2014, I sat down just to write my regular weekly blog post and started thinking about some things, some people that I had seen in therapy that were really kind of different from other people who just walked in and said, I'm struggling with depression. They walked in and said, I'm not real sure why I'm here, or gosh, I started having panic attacks, or I'm struggling with some anorexia, or I'm just tired all the time. And but they seemed very uneasy, AJ. They seemed like they didn't really know what they wanted to say or how they wanted to say it. And what I noticed about these folks was that when I asked them about any kind of painful experiences they might have had in their lives, and we all have painful experiences in our lives of some kind, they kind of scooted around the topic. They said, "Oh, nothing much has ever happened to me." When my questions got more specific, they would say, "Oh, well, yeah, I was raped in high school, but I just have never really talked about it. It, didn't seem to matter." And I would look at them and say, it didn't seem to matter. and they'd say, well, no, it's never really, I don't think it's bothered me, and things like that. And so I thought about these people who really, underneath that facade, once you scratch the surface, and sometimes you had to scratch it pretty hard, they are pretty diligently, at least, there was this underlying pathology, underlying depression
Mm.
that they didn't even realize was there. And in fact, it could be a fairly potent depression. And I called the post, I just kind of grabbed a term out of the air. I said, "Oh, let's call it perfectly hidden depression." Well, that post went viral. It was called "The Perfectly Hidden Depressed Person, Are You One?" And when it was on the Huffington Post, I received hundreds of emails. And over the years, I've received hundreds more about, how did you figure this out? It's like you're in my head. Um, Tell me, where can we read about this? And I looked and I said, surely somebody's writing about this. And I couldn't find anything. I found Dr. Brene Brown's work, of course, and she's phenomenal. And her research does talk about shame, perfectionism, but she does not, there where I could find, she does not link perfectionism with depression.
Mm.
In fact, most clinicians, and she's a researcher, not a clinician, but most clinicians think of perfectionism as a part of an anxiety issue. And it does. There is anxiety along with it. However, the research, when I looked in the scholarly research, academic research, there's a lot about perfectionism and depression and even suicidality.
Mm.
And they're finding that those things are linked. That there's some Canadian researchers, Dr. Gordon Flett, and actually there's some in Great Britain as well. And their names are not coming to me, but they are also very well known for their work on perfectionism. And so I started reading that work, as well as then there was a book, I Don't Want to Talk About It, by Terrence Real, who talked about covert depression in men. And he was actually trying to say that depression in men and women are different, and that idea never caught on traditionally. But it's a wonderful book. It's still out there. I don't want to talk about it. It's a great book. Um, so I decided to write a book. And I'd never wanted to write a book. I'd never thought of myself as an author. I just started writing a book. And I had a friend who, she was one of those friends who's, you know them via the internet mostly. And so you're friends with them, but you don't sometimes know too much about them. Well, it turns out she worked as an acquisitions editor for a literary agent. I just thought she was a writer. And she said, well, why don't you let me show this to my agent?
Mm.
Sure. Great. And he liked it and he took it. So I started writing the book proposal in 2016. It was bought by a publishing house in 2017, and it was published last year in November. So,
So the fundamental of that PhD, perfectly hidden depression, is perfection. What's wrong with perfection?
in and of itself, nothing. Perfectionism is actually, what's, I think, the primary definition you're going to find out there is it's a striving for excellence.
Mm,
And striving for excellence is a good thing. But perfectionism like that is more process oriented, meaning
mm,
that you just consider yourself a perfectionist. You want to do things well. You feel a little guilty if you don't do them well. You have some remorse about that. But you can enjoy the process and you work hard and you're proud of yourself at the end. Perfectionism the kind of perfectionism I'm talking about is much more driven by shame and fear, meaning that it is goal oriented, it's accomplishment oriented. You don't, you may look like you're enjoying the process, but it is incredibly pressured. You feel immediate and you feel an urgent and immediate need to meet the expectations of other people constantly.
mm,
And it is, you cannot say no. And it is something that actually the research calls it socially prescribed perfectionism, meaning it is you always have to be aware of what other people want from you, what other people expect from you, and you have to meet it. Or your shameful voice and your fear will say, you see, you're a big loser. No one, you really couldn't do this. Your dad was right. You'll never amount to anything. So it is what drives it that's very different and what makes it dangerous.
So, so that means you are trying to be perfect in other people's opinions, right?
Yes, which of course you can't control whether or not somebody may listen to this interview and say, that lady sounds like a nut to me. And somebody else will say, gosh, I need to look into that. I have no
Mm,
control over whether people, how people consider me or how they view me. I just, but if I am a perfectionist, like I'm talking about with perfectly hidden depression, I will do everything I can to control what others think.
yeah, and you mentioned about the socially prescribed depression, right?
Yes.
Is this the only cause? What about the self-criticism? Are
There are
there
three.
more types of this? Yeah, go on.
There are three kinds. There are three kinds of perfectionism that have been well researched. There's self-oriented perfectionism, which is more probably what we're talking about, where you are just striving for excellence and you expect a lot out of yourself, and it's just inherently who you are. Then there
Mm,
is other oriented perfectionism, meaning you expect perfection from others, and that probably makes you a very difficult person to work with. And then there's this socially prescribed perfectionism, and that has been found to be the most dangerous as far as developing depression and suicidality.
mm. And how do you differentiate PhD from the classical depression?
Oh gosh, there are a lot of differences. Now, I want to make this clear. Perfectly hidden depression, I'm certainly not narcissistic enough to think that I have come up with some kind of diagnosis that no one else has ever in the history of psychology. Perfectly hidden depression is what I call a syndrome, which probably the most well-known syndrome is codependence. Codependence isn't a diagnosis either. It is a group of behaviors and beliefs that are often found together, and that when they're found together, they tend to identify themselves sort of as a syndrome. And so um, that's how I envision perfectly hidden depression. So classic depression is definitely a diagnosis. You can be dysthymic, you can have major depression, you can have bipolar disorder. There are lots of different classifications of depression. So perfectly hidden depression, however, is different from classic depression in many ways. First of all, to be diagnosed with classic depression, you have to have one of two symptoms. You have to have a depressed mood for a certain period of time, and the amounts of time vary with the different diagnoses. And that depression, that melancholy or agitation or whatever your depression looks like, has to be noticeable to you or to others for a particular amount of time.
Hmm.
Second one it's a must, it's a required criteria, is what's called anhedonia. And anhedonia means you don't enjoy doing the things that have always brought you pleasure. You just don't do them anymore. You don't find any pleasure in them. And so perfectly hidden depression, someone is not going to look like that. They're not going to look like they're depressed. Nobody's going to say, in fact, even if they say to somebody, miraculously, sometimes I'm a little depressed. They go, you've always got a smile on your face. You've got more energy than the Energizer Bunny. What are you talking about? You certainly, I'd never, come on, you're just having a bad day or something. So, but there are other differences in that. For example, in the book, I talk about a guy who took a depression inventory who definitely identified with perfectly hidden depression, and he'd gone to a psychiatrist to see what was wrong because he thought something was wrong. Well, he scored very well on the depression inventory. He didn't look depressed at all. So I'm not sure what the psychiatrist said to him, but he sent him away. Well, 3 weeks later, he tried to kill himself, and the psychiatrist came to the hospital and said, well, I just saw you 3 weeks ago. What you didn't tell me what was going on. And the man looked at him and said, you didn't ask me the right questions. The question you asked me was, do you feel hopeless? And I said, no. If you had asked me if you felt hopeless, would you tell me or would you tell anyone? The answer would still be no. And that's the way you tell that someone is struggling with this, presenting a facade that looks perfect on the outside, but is can be very, very troubled on the inside.
This is interesting. Tell us few more such examples. Like one example of will you tell somebody when you feel hopeless? And the
Sure.
answer was no. Give me a few more examples.
Well, I will first say that when I began writing about this, I was trying to figure this out myself,
Mm,
AJ, because I didn't really know how to put this into words. I knew, my gut knew as a therapist, and other therapists have come up to me and said, we know what you're talking about. We just never put a label on it.
mm,
So, um, but I probably conducted about 60 interviews with people. I had, at the end of my posts, I would have, if you identify with this, would you please contact me because I want to do some interviews. I need to learn more. And actually, then some people began coming to my practice, and um, so what I heard from them were that in much greater detail, and I began forming this to sort of say. In fact, I remember I talked to a brain surgeon who um, told me that he's a professor at a very well recognized university in the United States. He but he his parents, especially his father, was very, very hard on him. Said he was dumb, that he'd never get anywhere, and he's incredibly successful. And he said, I cannot get my father's voice out of my head,
mm,
and every time I head into another surgery, I'm thinking I cannot make a mistake. And he doesn't. I mean, his record is impeccable. And so, but he's miserable. And one of the things they all told me, in fact, I asked them, why have you reached out to me? One of them was a advertising executive in California. Another one was a motivational speaker. um, and they would say, I reached out because this is the incredibly lonely way to live your life. And more than half of them had tried to die by suicide. And so they said, it's just, and I'll tell you another story. I was recently, about 3 months ago, I was contacted from some women out of Florida.
mm,
And they were telling me the story of their friend who had a great business, 3 children, mid 40s, beautiful, loved everybody, great friend to other people, and she died by suicide suddenly, obviously, and very deliberately. And what they discovered was my book on her night table. And so they
Oh,
began reading the book. And then they contacted me because they said, we've got to find out more about this. So, and I'm going to do some workshops with them. But basically, the classic things about depression are just not present. When we think of Kate Spade, who I had been diagnosed, I believe, with bipolar disorder, but she never told anybody. She was afraid her business would suffer if
mm,
anybody knew that she had a mental illness. And so, and she never told anyone that that I've read about so far, that she was actually suicidal. So she had, quote unquote, everything going for her, supposedly, but there were these inner demons inside of her that simply would not stop talking. Now, I've not read extensively about her case, but at least if she if she's identified with perfectly hidden depression, then that's what would be happening. There's constant shame, there's constant taking responsibility, there's the need for control, there's people don't know you are a really good friend to other people. You are caring, loving, generous. You're always the first person there when there's a problem, um, and yet no one really knows you. You often count your blessings, and I've had one woman come in and said, in fact, she really almost helped me write the book because she was so eloquent. And I saw her while I was writing the book, and she said to me one night about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, she said, this thing had happened to me. Um, well, let me see if I can share some details. She had been trying to get pregnant for years and had had multiple miscarriages. And so, but she had never grieved. She kept a smile on her face. She was just fine. She'd get through it. She believed she'd finally have a child one of these days, while her husband actually grieved a lot. And then they adopted a child. And all of this grief was waiting for her and just hit her. And she didn't know what it was. And she said she got up in the middle of the night and was looking. She said, could I be depressed? I don't think so. I finally had this child. I'm loving my life. And she looked up in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychology and Psychiatry, depression. And she said, oh no, I don't fit this criteria. I'm not tired. I don't feel hopeless. I don't feel helpless. My thinking is just fine. I don't have foggy thinking. And so, which are classic signs of depression. And she said she was so filled with shame and self-loathing because she'd even considered that she might be depressed. And I've heard that over and over and over again. These people, because a lot of them are very successful professionally, they have material things, they have not that that makes you happy, but basically their lives are going great. And so how could they possibly think something was wrong? But I'm here to tell you, and I know that's something my dad used to say, I'm here to tell you that that this is very real. And actually there's more and more of it. And what is scary is that the younger generation is also caught onto this. I I hear, because of what I've been writing about, probably I may hear about this more often than some, but one, suicide rates are going up exponentially worldwide, in all age groups except for 65 and older,
mhm.
and especially with the younger generation, because I heard something interesting the other day on Invisibilia, which is a podcast I just love, and they were talking about that this generation, your parents didn't say go be a lawyer or go be a whatever. They said, I just want you to be happy. And there's no tangible proof that you're happy. And so the younger generation is going, well, am I happy? Do do I do I have what it takes for me to be happy, or maybe I'm not happy? There's just a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity. You add COVID into that, And there are a lot of people who are afraid that the suicide rates will go even higher. In fact, there are some of our major universities here in the United States, Stanford being one of them, and the University of Pennsylvania being the other that I know about, have even adopted these rubrics, these kind of logos or something, I'm not sure what you'd call them, um, for the student who's trying to look like they're doing really well and they're not. University of Pennsylvania calls it the pen face. You put on the pen face. Stanford calls it the Stanford duck syndrome, where if you think about a duck, it's floating on the water. It looks like it's just gliding, but underneath its little feet are paddling, paddling, paddling. And that's what so they have set up student organizations saying, you don't have to look like you're doing well. This is hard.
Mm.
It's hard to get in. It's hard to stay in. And so they're trying to address the incredible rise in suicides in college students.
That makes it even more difficult to diagnose because you rightly mentioned that the people who are doing really well and everybody sees them as kind of role model, right? Everything that
Oh,
they
yeah.
do is right. And what will give them a hint that they might be suffering from PhD until they know about it? Like, I mean, awareness is one thing that we will also raise, but otherwise, how would somebody even think about it that I might be suffering from depression when everything is going just great?
I think a huge clue is to realize that you don't talk to anybody about what you struggle with. No one, maybe one person. And usually that person is someone who isn't with you physically. Maybe it's an old high school friend or something like that, or someone you met at camp. So you don't
Mm,
have to look at them in the eye. But if you never talk about your struggles, if you, I was certainly perfectionistic in my 20s. I didn't necessarily struggle with depression, but I can remember my life was in a shambles. I mean, I had a very chaotic decade in my 20s. But boy, when I was going home, I would I would pick up all the money I could possibly find. Maybe, you know, how you look down on the sofa pillows and you find change down in there. I would find all the money I could and I would go buy a new outfit. So I would look all put together for my family. And because I was so perfectionistic. And so basically, if you are walking around lonely in, you know, at night in your shower, things when you're really alone, and or if you have to constantly be doing something so your mind is not quiet, then you are avoiding something. If you have, it's called rigid compartmentalization, meaning compartmentalization is a skill. It's an ego skill. I had this interview at 9 o'clock this morning. Let's say I woke up at 6 and, oh, I don't know, my dog had died. Okay. So, but I had this interview to do. I would have to compartmentalize my grief over my dog. I would have to put it in a little box and
mm,
stick it in an emotional vault and lock the vault and then get it out when I had an appropriate time to feel it, right? That is an ego skill. We all do that all the time. We have things that make us incredibly happy that we sometimes have to put away, you know, because it's just not the time to celebrate. Or we have things that are really sad or that worry us or whatever, and we put it away, we compartmentalize it. But people who identify with perfectly hidden depression rigidly compartmentalize. That emotional vault is not only locked, but it's locked 4 times. I had one lady, I said to her, I was interviewing her, and I said, well, you know, what happens if something really more significant happens? What if your best friend moves away, or what if you find out you had cancer, or your husband has cancer, or what if, you know, what if something really large happens? She goes, if my box isn't big enough, I build a bigger box. So it's they're almost unconscious about this process of putting things away and not allowing themselves to feel pain. They don't. In fact, the researchers say, let's go back to research. Researchers say that perfectionists in general, not perfectly hidden depression, but perfectionists in general can they can They can identify when they feel something sad. They can say, oh, yes, that makes me sad. I'm sad about that. When you say, when you try to dig in, and I see this as a therapist all the time, when you say, well, when do you feel that? Oh, I'm not a crier. I just don't cry, or gosh, and they'll make a joke. If I started crying, I'd never stop.
Mm.
And so they avoid it. They avoid the sadness. They avoid knowing how to express it. And actually, I just am doing some research. There's a woman here in the United States, Lisa Feldman Barrett. I'm really excited about reading her work because she says that if you don't, that emotions are not innately in our brains, that actually emotions have to be learned, just like we have to learn what an onion smells like, or we have to learn what something tastes like, or we have to learn what something looks like, that our brain has to learn what certain emotions are. And so I'm putting her work into my thoughts, and I'm thinking, so if you weren't allowed in your family to ever have sadness or to ever have intense feelings that are hard, maybe the emotion isn't really there at all. Maybe you have sort of this dimly perceived view of it. This is all new. You're the first person I've talked to about this, but I'm really excited about it. I did my podcast about it, in fact, because I really hope I get to talk to her and say, "What is this thinking correct? Am I understanding what you mean?" Because that would mean that people with perfectly hidden depression may actually not have the emotions available to them that someone who was reared in a family where that was allowed and even supported, that they have to learn to feel those emotions.
What's the name of the lady again?
uh, Lisa Feldman Barrett, and her new book, which I have ordered, is called How Emotions Are Made. It's fascinating research. And there's also a man, let me see, I quoted Dr. Tim Lomas at the University of East London, who also he studies emotions. He's an anthropologist, I think, and studies emotions and which words for emotions, and how if you don't have a concept of an emotion, you don't have the verbiage for it, that you may not even know how to feel that emotion. So my next podcast is in fact, that will air Friday, is all on that. So I just read about that this weekend. It was very exciting.
Yeah, definitely. And looks and sounds super powerful that emotion can be learned. Well, we
Yeah.
should learn it the right way then.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So, what I've discovered, I think, about people who do identify with perfectly hidden depression is that at first it kind of scares them because, well, unfortunately, there still is a lot of mental stigma, and they don't necessarily, they may even, again, have this guilt or shame that they could even think that something was wrong or that they should have some compassion for themselves. Um, a man comes to mind, um, who was in my office, um, and he was talking about his childhood, and he talked about his mother used to throw rocks at him and tell him he wasn't going to ever amount to anything and get out of her sight.
Mm.
It turned out he had been an extremely successful man in his business, but he was retired, and guess what was happening? He was falling apart. He was drinking too much. He was being very angry, acting with his wife. And he didn't know what was going on. He thought, should I go back to work? What's going on? And so he came in, and he was just, that was so funny. Ha, ha, ha. And so I said, don't you have grandchildren? And he goes, yeah. And I said, okay, so what if we invited your grandson to go stand in my front yard of my office? And we both picked up rocks and threw it at him and said, you're not going to amount to anything. Would you think that was funny? And he got real quiet and he said, well, of course not. And I said, it wasn't funny then either. So why are you laughing? That's the kind of disconnect that you'll see with these people, that they make a joke out of something that was really hard that happened, or they kind of forget about it. And then they come back and say, oh, I kind of forgot that happened. Or they literally can even dissociate it like it didn't happen at all. So it's a what I have found is that once they realize they can be compassionate with themselves, they don't have to compare their lives with anybody else. There is a sense of relief. And the woman I told you about who had been through the infertility and um, you know, her work, she did some wonderful work. And what she did was she made a lot of connections with her family, but also with something that had happened in college sexually with a boyfriend that had just been terribly demeaning to her. And she decided she would never be demeaned again. And so, boy, she stayed in control. I mean, she was in control of everything, in, her emotions, her life, her marriage. So she said, I don't have to be in control. I don't have to be at the helm. I actually can accept help. It's incredible. And I've had more than one person tell me, AJ, sadly, that they didn't tell me this when they first walked in my office, but they said, I had a plan to kill myself when I came in your office, and now I don't, and I would never do that now.
Wow.
So, yeah, that's how lonely this can feel and how despairing.
Definitely. And whatever you have just shared in the last 5 minutes, especially, I believe the people watching this or listening to this podcast will find it super helpful because a lot of people don't even realize what is going on inside themselves. And I think
Mm-mm.
this kind of knowledge and information will definitely help them clear out some fog which they don't even see exist
That's
and
right.
don't
I
even
mean,
believe that exist. Yeah.
people can have incredible empathy for others, but
Mm,
when it comes to themselves, they hold
they're
themselves to,
cruel.
they're just, yeah, they're cruel, and this, they have this voice inside of them that's constantly editorializing, saying, your problems aren't important, you're not important, you're being
Mm,
selfish and self-centered to even think about yourself.
yeah.
So anyway, I hope it is
So
helpful.
yeah, yeah, very, very super helpful. And is there any science to support this? Are there any chemical imbalances that you normally see in the classical depression? Do we have something,
No,
any studies done so far?
no, I mean, this is, I mean, perfectionism has been known to be a problem. People were writing about it back in the 40s and 50s. Um, so perfection, but it's kind of been considered a character trait. And as I said, some clinicians have said to me, well, yeah, we see this all the time, but we just didn't have a name for it. So again, I don't know. I have not seen any research that has actually looked at the neurobiology of this.
Mm,
Um, uh, and again, perfectly hidden depression is my term. Um, and when I wrote the book, I thoroughly expected to be really challenged by some people, and I'm sure when it gets, if it ever gets to any kind of prominence, then it will be. I doubt seriously if the American Psychological Association is going to call me and say, "Oh, well, we want to talk to you more about this," because for one thing, new things kind of, the old way of thinking that these criteria have to be met in order for you to diagnose depression. And so if they're not met, you're doing harm rather than good,
mm,
um, by putting it out there that this is a problem. But I've been a clinician now for 27 years, and I know this is a problem. And I'm not, just because it doesn't fit classic criteria, so what? Then it's a new animal. It's another presentation of depression. And I've had some therapists ask me, but okay, so let's say someone's sitting in front of me, and, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know. Um, I don't know that this is a thing. And, if I don't know, if they're not going to tell me they're depressed, how am I supposed to figure this out? And I've likened it to heart research, uh, cardiovascular research. Years ago, the only people who were studied for having heart attacks were men. So all the statistics, all the findings, all the symptoms of heart attacks had to do with men, and women were dying from heart attacks.
Mm.
And when they finally began studying women, they figured out, oh, women have different symptoms. They can have the similar symptoms, but they could also have different symptoms. So all of a sudden, cardiologists realized, oh, heart attack can look more ways than one. You know, someone could be diagnosed as possibly having heart disease when they don't have the classic symptoms like men do. So it raised their awareness that there was a whole other presentation of cardiovascular problems that they needed to be aware of. That's what I'm trying to do with the mental health profession, to say, okay, there's a whole nother presentation of depression that is not going to fit the classic symptom picture. It's just not going
Okay.
to fit it. These people are
Mm.
not going to look anhedonic. As I said before, they will not tell you they're hopeless or helpless or that their thinking is impaired. In fact, their thinking is just fine, thank you, except they have this guilt and shame going on all the time. Um, they may tell you they're tired. Um, they they may say something about wanting to die, but I doubt it. Certainly not at first. Um, and they don't really know what they're there for. And usually, you know, there there are some classic mental illnesses that can be can go along with perfectly hidden depression. For example, you could have bipolar disorder and also identify with perfectly hidden depression. You could have an eating disorder. In fact, eating disorders are fairly common because guess what eating disorders are all about? Control. You can have panic attacks. You can have social anxiety. You can have, in fact, especially OCD, obsessive
Mm.
compulsive disorder. You know, it's not that you can't have a true diagnosis along with your this persona you've created, and actually that may be what brings you into therapy. You may be having panic disorder, or you may be down to 100 pounds when you're 5'8", you know.
Mm.
And so it's there are problems that are therapeutically obviously very important, and but you could also identify with this syndrome.
So you mentioned that you've seen cases in children as well. Now, I'm curious to understand, when do we learn this? Because this is a kind of behavior, right? When do we learn it? Is it happening at home when we are really, really young, less than 10 years of age, or it's happening in school? Where are we actually getting this kind of behavior?
Well, to make it clear, I don't see children. So, but what my theory is that this is caused, it's created in your childhood. It can
Mm.
also, like I told you about the woman who had the horrible experience in college, I think you can have other experiences that also influence it. But what I did in the book was try to tell stories of people who, because um, there are many ways that it can be created. It can be created in an environment where there's sexual abuse or any kind of abuse. It can be created by neglect. It can be created by just scorn and ridicule. It can be created somewhat interestingly and differently if you're the star of the family, if you are the accomplished one, and your family tells you that's basically your responsibility. That's your role in this family. You know, you don't give us any trouble, and so you just that's your rubric. I mean, that's what you start doing. um, it can be caused by what's called enmeshment, meaning that a parent is living through you, and so you become this very pressured, I have to do my best, I have to do very well. In some cultures, there are males in general are just told they shouldn't have any kind of painful or vulnerable, no vulnerability, that's just not allowed. I think it can be caused in certain cultures. I'm working with some African American women right now, and they're telling me, Margaret, being perfect is the way that I got a chance to actually get a chance. If I weren't the best, if I weren't, you know, the most wonderful, the smartest, the best in class, the funniest, the wittiest, whatever, then I would not be where I am today. And
Mm.
they say giving up my perfectionism is this very scary. Um, so they're sort of, we say in Arkansas, there's a lot of ways around the barn. Um, you know, uh, there are many ways it can be created, and but basically, unfortunately, there are a lot of homes where feelings just aren't allowed. There's
Hmm.
just no feeling at all. I worked with a guy one time who said his mother died when he was 3 or 4, and he, I had not worked with this, but he definitely, he would have identified with perfectly hidden depression if I had been writing about it at the time. And what his father did was he took all the pictures of his mother down. He remarried very quickly, had him call her mother, and it was as if his mother had never existed. And this guy was superhero. He was uber kind, uber smart, uber hard worker. You know, he and completely avoidant of sadness. So you know, all I think a lot of these experiences can be formed, and if, of course, if Lisa Feldman Barrett, who we just talked about, is correct, then these, her theory makes a lot of sense, that you just don't learn this emotion, so you don't learn self-compassion. It's just not in your repertoire.
Yeah, I mean, that makes it even more tricky because I wanted to know from you how we can avoid it earlier than right, but it's really tricky because you don't even know that you have it, right? And then I don't know
Well,
what kind of behaviors or skills the parents should actually teach their children so that they cannot get this kind of PhD, for example.
here in the US, um, if a teenager kills themselves, or a young person kills themselves, immediately on the morning talk shows, you will see this list of classic depression signs,
Mm,
and they should be there. I mean, we're not saying classic depression doesn't exist, it does. And so isolativeness, falling behind in school, changing friends, sleeping too much or not sleeping at all those things are signs that your teenager may be in trouble. I want to throw a pillow at the TV set because what I think they should also be saying is, especially if this is a surprise suicide, I say, are you talking to your child about your own vulnerability? Are you teaching them that it's okay for you to have a problem and admit it and reveal it and then work on it? I think that's a huge gift you can give your child. My own child in college called me one time and he was telling me about something. He was very upset, I could tell. And he called me and said, I need to talk to you about X. And he knew I had done X in college, not ecstasy, but I'm just saying, I don't want to name the
yeah.
problem. But he knew I had done it. And so myself, and my first instinct was to get into mom, go, oh, I can't believe you did that. And then I stopped myself and said, okay, let's talk about it. And he told me later, he said, Mom, I called you because I knew you had struggled with this yourself. And so he could be vulnerable with me and with himself. And I was so happy to hear the process of that meant actually more to me than the actual problem.
Mm,
That he had learned, hope from me and my husband, that it's okay to say, I'm not perfect, I make mistakes, I do stupid stuff, I do stuff I regret, um, I'm I'm sad, I'm hurt, sometimes I get angry, and all of those things are not only can be talked about but should be talked about.
this is super interesting, Dr. Rutherford, and I wanted to ask you so many different questions, but in the interest of time, I would ask you one question that I ask almost all my guests, which
Yeah.
is, what are the top three skills or behaviors that we should teach children in order to be successful and thrive, but those skills or behaviors are not taught in schools?
I think I just said one of them. I said, you're not going to be taught in school that it's okay to be vulnerable. You're not going to be taught in school to be kind to yourself and to others. Your school is an inherently competitive place. School is a place where if you get an A, you've done well. If you get a C, eh. So schools, in fact, actually, at least as far as my particular passion is concerned, don't do a great job of helping us see ourselves as individuals with our unique strengths. Um, and then the other thing I thought of, AJ, was, I wish that I had known in school that what I really needed to learn, I wasn't going to learn in school. That I think I came out of school thinking, okay, I've got the skills now. I'm ready to head into life. And boy, did I take a plunge. I mean, just a huge plunge because I did not have enough emotional maturity. Teach, it's not school's job to teach emotional maturity,
Hmm.
but I certainly didn't learn it along the way. And um, so I got out and made a lot of mistakes. I made a complete mess out of my life. And yet you can turn that boat around. Maybe, I don't know if school teaches that either. Um, you can be vulnerable, you can make mistakes, you can dig a hole for yourself, and you can, hang on to that shovel, because you can also use that shovel to get yourself out.
Excellent. Yeah, that's so powerful. Thank you very much for sharing that. So now you have written a book, which is really, really useful. And you have your podcast. You've already been downloaded more than a million times, 1.6 to be precise. I'm curious to know what is next. What's your goal now?
What's next? The book, by the way, is on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can get it there in London or wherever. It's being translated into 7 different languages right now, so that's kind of
Wow.
fun. Um, I'm talking to the publishers about doing a workbook. The book is actually a workbook in and of itself. It has over 60 exercises because I'm a clinician and I want to help people learn how to not do this. And so there are 5 steps in the book, and 5 easy steps. They're not easy. Some of them are quite difficult, in fact. And of course, if you have a lot of trauma in your life that you've never dealt with, you should do that work with a therapist, because that if it's severe trauma, then but you can take the book with you. But I'm thinking about writing an actual workbook for it. And
Mhm.
then I'm thinking about also doing a therapist manual. But I've got a seed of another book in my head. I don't know, writing this one nearly killed me. But I've got it in my head. It's not well formulated enough right now for me to talk about it, but it's working its way in between my neurons. They're firing and seeing what's there.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is going to be really helpful, and all the best for the new book and
Thank
new workbook.
you.
It will
Thank you.
be
And
really useful.
congratulations on this venture. I think this is wonderful. When you were telling me about it, it's really such a great effort for the schools and to help people who are trying to come out into life and learn some stuff. And if I've been helpful, then I'm very honored.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So finally, Dr. Rutherford, how can people reach you if they want to?
My website is drmargaretrutherford.com, and my podcast is on there. My book is on there. You can email me. I have email. I'd be happy for people to email me. It's askdrmargaret at drmargaretrutherford.com. And that's the best way to reach me. So I'm ready and willing to talk to anybody.
Wow, thank you. I'll put all of those details in the description below. Thank you
Sure.
very much for your time, Dr. Rutherford. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot, the things that I could never read anywhere else. Thank you very much for that.
You're so welcome, AJ. I'm so glad to be here, and I'll come back if you want me to.
Yes, we would need it because I think I had so many more questions which I couldn't ask in the interest of time. But
Okay.
thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Guys, if you are resonating a little bit with what have been spoken today, then please do check the website and all the social media and podcast of Dr. Rutherford. It is really immensely helpful. I believe a lot of people will be able to resonate with what we were talking today. And if you have not yet done so, and if you find that this video has added some value to you, then please do consider subscribing to my channel. And don't forget to hit that notification icon so that you get notification to all my future videos. I will see you again. Thank you. Bye.